thank you all for being here tonight. I'm Mayor G.T. Bynum. I want to, just to start off the meeting, go through a couple of things to kind of bring the meeting for tonight into focus before we hear from our experts. The first thing is important to understand how we got to this point tonight. It's important to acknowledge that people have been putting in work on this for decades to get us to this step. There are great leaders in this community who did not allow this issue to fall into history or even not be recorded in history, which was the path it was headed on until we had some great community leaders and historians step up to make sure that that would not happen. And if it weren't for their work, we wouldn't be here tonight. The work of our Public Oversight Committee and this process that we've been undergoing this year to this point has been focused on phase one of our investigation. And that's focused on the initial geophysical investigations of the most likely sites based on historical research. Tonight, we'll be seeing the information from that investigation at two of our most likely sites for the first time as a group together. The results that we see tonight are going to determine whether we begin planning for a second phase relative to these locations, which would, or at least could include excavation at these sites. And the key decision that we're going to need to make in the coming months to prepare for that coming phase is based on what we hear tonight. And so what I want to ask, especially our Public Oversight Committee members, but everyone in attendance tonight, as you hear the presentation, the key question for all of us to consider in what's presented is whether or not, based on the evidence that is presented, we need to begin planning for phase two at these sites and discuss what that looks like at an upcoming meeting. So that is our goal for this evening, is to fully understand the evidence and the analysis that's presented, and then use that in the coming weeks and months to make that determination on what a second phase could look like based on what we hear tonight. Just from a logistical standpoint for the meeting tonight, we will hear the presentation in its entirety, and then we'll have questions. If any of our Oversight Committee members have questions of the panelists, they'll have the opportunity to do so, and then anybody in attendance that has a question that you would like to ask, you can do so. What we would ask is that you capture any questions that you have throughout the course of the presentation on cards that you should have received when you came in. If you haven't, just raise your hand and somebody can get one to you. And then we have people throughout the room will come back and collect those so that we can get through as many questions and comments as we can this evening in the period of time that we have available. Restrooms are in the back, should anyone need them. And again, we will not make a decision tonight on what phase two looks like. The point of tonight's meeting is to hear the presentation, to hear what these experts have found based on the data they've collected over the last couple of months. And then the expectation would be that our next meeting, which is on February 3rd, we would then have a discussion about if there's a need for a phase two at these sites, what that might look like, and that will of course be discussed as well. It's been a key value for us as a committee every step of the way that this process be transparent and openly discussed. So we will see this presentation tonight, we'll learn this tonight, and then we're going to have a lot of dialogue around this, I assume, this evening and in the weeks and months ahead. But any future planning will all be openly discussed in these meetings in the months ahead. So at this time, I want to turn it over to give an overview of our investigative process to Dr. Scott Ellsworth, who is one of those people who's been working on this for decades. Dr. Ellsworth.
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. This is going to be a historic night in the history of our city. And obviously the main focus tonight will be, you'll be hearing reports on the nature of our investigation, particularly the archaeological investigation and the scanning we did at 3 suspected burial sites, unmarked burial sites of massacre victims from 1921. I can tell you that after all of these presentations, there will still be plenty of questions. There'll be still plenty of questions about what happened in 1921. There'll still be plenty of questions as to where we need to go to next and what we need to do. But despite those questions, I can assure you that tonight the nature of the conversation will change. A couple things to bear in mind before we look at these individual sites, just to keep in the back of your mind. The first is that we don't know to this day how many people were killed in the 1921 race massacre or race riot. We simply do not know. 20 years ago, as part of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, we were able to confirm 35 individuals who were killed, all right? I think that, in my own belief, is that a reasonable number can go as high as 300. I think that others believe that many more people were killed as well, too, but we do not know that. All of the victims whose remains we have been searching for are homicide victims. These are murder victims. Please keep that in mind. Almost all of them, with one exception, were also buried by strangers. They were buried by people they did not know, people who did not know them. These were burials, for the most part, that were controlled by the white authorities. The people burying them were both black and white, but likely they did not know these individuals. Most of these burials happened during the period of martial law that was declared in Tulsa and lasted for a few days after the riot. While these burials are happening, the family members of these deceased individuals were all being held under armed guard at the baseball park, at convention hall, and whatnot. They did not know that their loved ones were dead, or they did not know what was happening to them. The authorities never told them where these individuals were buried, and there were never any funerals. There were no goodbyes from family members. There were no family preachers saying words and things like this. These were things that were very much hidden. And as well, I think it's important to remember, particularly as the days after the riot went on, that the remains of these individuals were not viewed by the authorities, by the white authorities, as brothers and fathers and mothers and sisters, but rather as a health problem that had to be contained, and so literally these people were, for the most part, thrown away. So how do we get to these sites? How do we get here? And let me curtail the story and just say that 21 years ago, under the auspices of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, Dick Warner of the Tulsa Historical Society and I launched an intensive 2-year effort to see if we could locate the unmarked burial grounds of riot victims in Tulsa. I say that Dick and I did it, but we had a whole lot of help. We had dozens of riot survivors, dozens of elderly Tulsans who helped us. We had expert advice from Dr. Clyde Snow, renowned forensic anthropologist and human rights expert. Certainly plenty of good advice from Dr. John Franklin, famed historian from here in Tulsa. We had help from community activists and others. Kevin Ross, who was on the Public Oversight Committee, gave us key help, at a certain point. But we talked to cemetery workers, funeral home directors, talked to law enforcement members. I can tell you that we unearthed, in the end, we spoke with over 300 individuals over that 2-year period from all walks of life in Tulsa. We also were able to unearth documents that had not been seen in more than 75 years that gave us some hints and indications where some of these people may have been buried. And we walked the ground of every single cemetery in Tulsa, certainly every one that dated back to the 1920s or earlier. We identified 3 sites. I'll discuss those a little bit later. And as a result of that identification, Dr. Bob Brooks, who is then the Oklahoma State archaeologist, arranged for the first scanning or geophysical survey using ground-penetrating radar at 3 of our sites. The results were uneven, I would say. Part of it had to do with the equipment was not very good 20 years ago. Part of it had to do with interference from high power lines and whatnot as well. But there were some anomalies that we discovered at a couple of those sites that had the promise of potentially being unmarked burial sites. However, when the scanning occurred, what had gone on in Tulsa broke into first a national news story and then an international news story. And our efforts got caught up in politics, and we were shut down. We were shut down first by the members of the Riot Commission, and secondly by the city of Tulsa. And at that point, our work ceased. All right. So last spring, Mayor Bynum asked me to help jumpstart this investigation once again, which I was certainly happy to do. My old colleague, Dick Warner, had passed away in 2007, but Dick's daughter, Betsy Warner, very quickly stepped up and filled his shoes. And I can tell you that we've done a fairly intensive amount of research during the past 6 months, particularly this summer, reviewing our old data, reviewing our old documents, going through old interviews, reading old interview transcripts and whatnot, and also turning up some new material as well. And in the end, by the end of the summer, we had identified a 4th location as a potential riot burial site. So, pardon me? Massacre. Excuse me, I've been calling it the Tulsa Race Riot for about 45 years, and I'm doing my best on that. So please, let's give me a little slack on that. We have 4 different locations. Let me just explain briefly what they are, how we got to them, and what the evidence was, and then I'm going to turn it over to Scott Hammerstedt to talk about the results of the geophysical work. So the first is Oak Lawn Cemetery, which, as many as you know, is located at 11th and Peoria. In 1921, this was a city-owned cemetery, owned and operated by the city, as it is today. It was also a segregated cemetery. There was an African-American section and white sections. There was also a potter's field for impoverished, for paupers and others who were buried, for families who could not afford a funeral and whatnot, and to be able to buy a plot. That was also divided into white and black areas. And I can tell you that 20 years ago, we sort of honed in on Oak Lawn Cemetery quite early. Shortly after the riot, Walter White of the NAACP, who was later the executive secretary of the NAACP, came to Tulsa, interviewed people, both whites and blacks, about the riot, wrote up a national story once he got back to New York on what had happened. During that time, he interviewed O.T. Johnson, who was the commandant of the Tulsa chapter of the Salvation Army. Johnson was quoted in White's article as talking about how the Salvation Army had fed 37 grave diggers on 2 nights and another 20 on 2 other nights. And we did the math on that. Clyde Snow told us it took one man basically 8 hours to dig one grave. And if you added up the number of grave diggers that were fed, you come up with about 110 graves. And the idea that you had individual grave diggers made us think there must be individual graves. Neither Johnson nor White told us where these graves were located, and we have not known that to this day. But we got interested in Oak Lawn early on as a result of that. And then a few months later, Dick made a great discovery in the back room of a local white-owned funeral home, which is he found some funeral home ledgers that had not been looked at in 75 years, and those ledgers proved that this particular funeral home billed the county of Tulsa for the burial of 18 riot victims, African-American riot victims, 13 of whom were named, 5 of which were unnamed. They also indicated that they were buried in Oak Lawn Cemetery. Unfortunately, however, any of the records that we had for Oak Lawn Cemetery, any of the materials that we could find, did not indicate anywhere where these individuals were buried. okay? So we knew then, and we know today, that at least 18 African-American riot victims are buried in Oaklawn. We do not know where. Thirdly, after the word broke about our work on this, we got our first and really only eyewitness to a riot burial, a gentleman by the name of Clyde Eddy, the white youth, 10 years old at the time of the riot, lived across the street from Oaklawn, was cutting through the cemetery a couple days after the riot, noticed a bunch of huge wooden packing crates, the type that he said oil field equipment might be packed in, or pianos. He lifted up the lid on one of the crates, looked inside. He saw what he thought were 3 or 4 bodies of African Americans inside, went to a second crate, lifted it up, saw the same thing, and then was chased away by the workmen who had dug a trench and were preparing to bury these victims. They chased him away, but Eddie stood on the other side of this metal iron fence, which you can look through, watched for a while. And he contacted us in 1999 and told us the story. He also pointed out the area in the cemetery where he thought the burial had happened. So this summer, in rethinking the situation at Oaklawn, our thinking started to change on this. To begin, there was a problem with the Clyde Eddy site, and the problem with the Clyde Eddy site was simply this. The area that he had pointed where this burial took place was in the white part of the cemetery. And we did not believe that the white cemetery workers in 1921 would bury African-American bodies on the other side of the Jim Crow line and in the white part of the cemetery. So either Mr. Eddy had his location incorrect, or that the bodies were actually bodies of whites. We don't know. The second thing is that Betsy Warner, after a tremendous Herculean effort, finally kind of cracked the code on the burials at Oaklawn Cemetery in the 1920s, and she figured out where actually the area would be in the cemetery where bodies would have been buried in 1921. Interesting, it aligned up with the only 2 known African-American riot headstones in the cemetery, one for Reuben Everett and the other for Eddie Locker. Reuben Everett was a part of that original 18 identified African-American riot victims buried in the cemetery, but Eddie Locker was not. We did not know, however, why those headstones were where they were located. Again, the cemetery records were incomplete, the old maps were missing, records that we searched for all over were simply gone. But we began to think now that perhaps near those 2 headstones in a bare, blank area, that may be a place where those original 18 were buried. Thirdly, we spoke this summer with Tim Mills. Tim is a former sexton at Oaklawn Cemetery, the manager of the cemetery. And Tim informed us that there was a long-standing oral tradition amongst the sextons of the cemetery, all of whom are white, that have been passed down from generation to generation, that pointed out a certain blank area called the Sextons area in the far northwest corner of the African American section, that the lore had it is where riot victims had been buried. We later spoke with other sextons. Also, I can say that Reverend Turner and Counselor Hall Harper also connected us with the grandson of a sexton we had not spoken to, and he too pointed towards that area as a potential area. Okay, so at Oaklawn Cemetery, we then identified 3 areas that we wanted to focus on with the scanning. The one which we'll call the Clyde Eddy site, which was this long band of ground along the 11-seat side that would also include his original idea of this burial happening on the white side of the Jim Crow line, further extending to the west. The second would be this area we call the original 18, which is this bare area near those 2 1921 headstones. And the third area is this Sextons area. Okay, we'll return to that. The second area, the second site that we focused on was New Block Park. I can tell you there's been a very, very rich oral tradition in both the African American and white communities extending back decades that pointed to New Block Park as a site of riot burials. We have eyewitness accounts and secondhand accounts of citizens, white citizens, seeing trucks with bodies on them being driven towards New Block Park. There's also reports of railroad cars, flat cars with bodies on them being seen in the area of New Block Park. There was also, there had been a city incinerator there. It was a dump. It was an area of great interest, but we could never figure out where exactly people might have been buried. Then Dick and I ran into a story, again, 20 years ago, from a man by the name of Jack Britton. And in 1945, when he's about 14 years old, Jack Britton lived nearby, was walking along the railroad tracks between the river and New Block Park, came upon a group of workmen who were building, to his mind, some sort of a swimming pool. And what they had found was just a cache of human bones, skulls, leg bones, hip bones, and whatnot. Jack Britton talked to the workmen and learned from them that those were apparently a burial site of riot victims. 2 days later, Jack Britton returns to the area, and it's been filled in and covered up and whatnot. So we got excited about that initially. There was a swimming pool at New Block Park. I swam there as a child in the 1960s. The problem is that swimming pool was built in 1927 and 1945. So there was not a way to connect those two stories together. Then Dick Warner was digging through records in the sewage department for the city and found out that something called a sewage lift pump station, which would be the size of a small room, had been built in 1945, and we figured that a 14-year-old kid might see this rectangular excavation and think that that was some sort of a swimming pool. So that was our site at New Block Park. The third site is an outlier in many different ways. It's the historic Booker T. Washington Cemetery, which is now located is now a part of the Rolling Oaks Burial Park. This is way out south on 91st Street between Harvard and Yale. It's also a historic African-American cemetery that predates the race massacre. A number of prominent families and others have their loved ones buried there. On Memorial Day of 1997, an elderly African-American riot survivor, a woman, met with cemetery workers during the Memorial Day activities. She told numerous workers the same story. And the story was that her grandfather had owned a truck, and the truck was not destroyed during the massacre. And once African Americans were released from under armed guard at the ballpark and convention hall and whatnot, and came back to their homes, as they're going through the rubble and the wreckage of their businesses and homes, occasionally the remains of human bodies were found, and that this woman's grandfather then drove those remains out to Booker T. Washington Cemetery to bury them. This is the one example of sort of black on black burials, okay? The others are white people are in control. These are members of the community who are burying their own in their own cemetery. We tried a long time to identify this woman, to track her down. We went to elaborate devices. The following Memorial Day in 1998, she did not show up. But that same day, who showed up was a riot survivor no one had known about, a gentleman by the name of Elwood Lett. And Elwood Lett told, without hearing about this woman's story, told us, a story. He pointed to an area of the cemetery where this woman had pointed to as well, too, and said that maybe 3 years after the riot, he was playing in that area with his young cousins when his aunt and uncle yelled at them, "Get away from there, that's where the riot people are buried." So we had two sources, both from the African American community, the Booker T. Washington Cemetery, that victims of the riot had been buried there. All right, the fourth area, and I'm just about done, is a triangular stretch of land that is just off where the old 11th Street Bridge is across the Arkansas River that we refer to as the Canes. It's referred to as the Canes because that is one of the names of a homeless encampment that exists there today. It's also known as the Old Camp as well, too. So as you know, this is where the 244 bridge crosses the river. There's also an old railroad bridge furthest upstream. And there is a railroad line, which is sort of the top of this pyramid. The other side is going to be one other railroad line, and the third side will be the Arkansas River. So it's this triangular shaped area. And we had been drawn to this area, which is quite close to New Block, is practically in New Block Park for some time. Again, this strong oral tradition that says that riot victims were buried in this area. We had also discovered, there was an ice plant nearby, and we had also discovered, Betsy Warner discovered, that in June of 1921, the county purchased something like 3 tons of ice, and never before or since. And we started wondering, this is hot, maybe this ice might have been used to try to help preserve bodies until they figured out what to do with it. But we also had another piece of very powerful evidence. During the winter of 1970, 1971, a local historian and radio personality and businessman, a man by the name of Ed Wheeler, decided that he was going to write an article for the Tulsa World or the Tulsa Tribune about the history of the massacre on its 50th anniversary. And Wheeler went to work interviewing dozens of people on both sides of town, African-American riot survivors, whites as well too, digging through whatever records he could find. And I can tell you he was threatened with his life twice. Neither the World nor the Tribune would publish his article when he was finished with it. But along the way, he spoke with an elderly white gentleman who told him that probably on June 2nd, not on June 1st, but on June 2nd, he went out on that railroad bridge that is at the top of this Canes area, and there was a sandbar in the Arkansas River which ran under the bridge, but was also right next to that triangular-shaped area. And that gentleman counted 68 bodies, primarily African-American, but also some whites, that were laid out on this sandbar. He then came back 2 days later, and all the bodies were gone. Okay. So it was our feeling, maybe we're getting close somewhere here. Maybe that ice was used to preserve these bodies while the authorities are trying to figure out what to do with them. This would also connect with, there was a very rich oral tradition, again, in the black community, the white community, about bodies being thrown in the Arkansas River. I heard it, probably many of you all heard it as well, too. This gave a slightly different twist on it, and we have eyewitness accounts of people seeing bodies being dropped off that railroad bridge. We think that they were dropped actually onto the sandbar and not into the river itself. Okay. All right. So then what happened is that in 2002, after our first efforts had been shut down, a former Tulsa police officer by the name of Bob Patty contacted Randy Crable of the Tulsa World and had some information about riot burials. Crable then referred this gentleman to Dick Warner. Dick met this officer, Mr. Patty, at the Denver Grill in 2002, and they had a long conversation. And the story that Officer Patty recounted was this, that during 1973, in the middle of the night after he had gotten off of his shift, he was in the break room at Tulsa Police Headquarters, decompressing, having a cup of coffee with some other officers, when an older officer, a sergeant by the name of Wayborn Cotton, came into the room carrying a cardboard box. And he says, "Come here, I've got to show you all something." And the box was of all of riot photographs. And according to Sergeant Cotton, that in maybe 2 or 3 days after the riot, after the city fathers realized that the riot was a great black mark on the city and they had to do something about it, they instructed police officers to go to all the photography studios in town and collect any riot photographs and confiscate them. And allegedly this box, held those confiscated photographs. Sergeant Patty described 3 of the photographs in detail, but there was one and none of which I have ever seen. But there was one of particular interest, and it appeared to show a mass burial of riot victims. It was taken from a slightly elevated position, looking down into a trench that ran towards the photographer. Okay? At the end of the trench was an old-fashioned steam shovel, which had apparently been used to dig this trench. There were bodies at the bottom of the trench, and there were other bodies wrapped in tarpaulin that were apparently being prepared to be lowered into the trench. Everyone involved who's alive is white in this photograph, in Mr. Patty's description. He also said that there were the people in charge were white men wearing black cowboy hats, black western ties, cowboy boots, belt buckles and all that, directing sort of what is going on. There might have been somebody throwing white powder, perhaps lime, into where these bodies were, okay? But interestingly, also, you can see off to the right a curving railroad track and a bluff that's right there. When he saw this, Officer Patty said, I know what this is. This is over by Crosby Heights. Crosby Heights is a very old Tulsa neighborhood that's near, Quanah Street, 11th Street. It's right across the railroad tracks from this Canes area, okay? Mr. Patty then said that as soon as he said that, the sergeant stiffened, he put the photographs away and took them away. And then about a week later, according to Mr. Patty, Sergeant Cotton came back once again and said, don't you talk about this, don't you mention this. So this information allowed us to develop a new theory. And our theory was this, that the city authorities had a number of bodies, they're trying to figure out what to do with them. It's hot, the bodies are decomposing rapidly. Regardless of what has gone on at Oaklawn Cemetery, they're bodies that they've let out on this sandbar, in the Arkansas River next to this Canes area. They're trying to figure out what to do with them. When I went to see the Canes area, I've been there a number of times now, but the first time, there's sort of an upper level that's visible from across the railroad tracks from the houses that are in the Crosby Heights addition. But there's a lower shelf that is right next to the river, just up from the river, that's quite flat. So our belief is that they brought in a bulldozer there, dug a trench, that's our hypothesis, and buried the bodies there, okay? So those, once again, those are our 4 sites: Oaklawn Cemetery, New Block Park, Booker T. Washington Cemetery, and finally the Canes, all right? So we were able in October to do scanning. I've been told by the archaeologists you have to call it geophysical survey at 3 of the 4 sites, namely at Oaklawn, New Block, and the Canes. We are still in negotiations with the owner of Booker T. Washington Cemetery to do the scanning there. I am fully confident that we will scan there, and we will do that at some point after the new year. But I am just the first stage in this, so let's bring Scott Hammerset up to the podium, and he can tell you what we've discovered in October.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My task today is to present the results of the geophysical survey we did in October, like Scott mentioned. Just sort of launch right into it. I think the first thing I want to make sure that I emphasize is the nature of geophysical study is that it provides us a glimpse at an anomaly, and I can make some recommendations on what I think these things might be, but it's going to take some further work to sort of push it over the edge for further proof, so I want people to keep that in mind as I go forward here. Just as a quick overview, we use 3 different types of equipment. The first one is a gradiometer, which measures sort of subtle or not so subtle magnetic variations in the soil. Is this, the light's too bright? Yeah. Good, because I can't see anything. They're blinding me. Is there anybody who can do something about that?
There's no options. There's no dimmer on it.
Okay, well, I guess it's on or off, right? Okay, we're just going to cut the lights off, I think, so if that'll work. No? Oh, you guys, right? Sorry. I'm not used to having as many cameras on me. Okay, but we'll just hopefully try to soldier through this, and I'll point out things as best as I can. Again, the first machine we use is a gradiometer. It measures very subtle magnetic anomalies in the soil. But it's good at a project like this because it picks up not only disturbances, but metal it's very sensitive to metal, so things like belt buckles and things like that will show up fairly cleanly. We also used an electrical resistance meter, which puts an electrical pulse into the ground and essentially measures the resistance of what's below it to that current. In other words, basically a moisture content difference. The last one we used is a ground penetrating radar, which shoots a pulse into the ground, which then reflects back up and can tell us not only how deep something is, but also how big it is horizontally. And the reason we use all three of these techniques is they measure the same thing in different ways, but they're very complementary to each other. As you'll see as I go forward, some of these instruments worked well in some places and not so well in others. So yeah, that really is bad, isn't it? I'm sorry. Okay, well the first area we're going to talk about is New Block Park. Just here's an image of the park and just sort of showing the area we surveyed sort of on the sort of eastern edge of it. Visit the magnetometer, radiometer results are here on the left, the electrical resistance is on the right. The problem we had here was we had a lot of interference from the nearby electrical wires, and so we had all this striping that affected the data, but what we do have are these long linear anomalies here, here, and here they are again in the radar. I don't believe that these are, well, what I believe these are probably pipes or ditches that have been backfilled. I don't think they're anything related to what we were looking for. This area's had a lot of land modifications since the 20s, and I think these are just naturally occurring things. I saw nothing in the data to make me think that there are any graves associated with the massacre in this section of New Block Park. And if there were any there, I think they might have been wiped out by whatever this land modification had been.
Go back one, just
Sure.
one more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, these sort of long black areas are higher magnetism, and that's what it looks like often when there's a pipe or when there's a ditch or something that was backfilled. But these squares are 60 feet across, so they're really large and they don't really look like anything that I would interpret as a mass grave of any sort. This is the Canes. Overview of it here, the railroad tracks and the highway. The area we looked, here's that triangle-shaped land that we talked about. The area we looked was down in here. Currently, it's a homeless encampment, and so there's lots of stray metal and things around down there, so we were not able to use the gradiometer. Also, I don't know how well you can see over here on the side, it's very sandy there. Sandy soil that's very dry is not very good for the resistance meter, so we weren't able to use it. However, we did use the radar. We looked in two areas. The first one you can see in this photograph, the other one was maybe about 100 feet further to the west. The second area we looked, there wasn't anything there. However, this area, the first area here, the second area, excuse me, we do have two fairly large anomalies. Oops. This is a horizontal slice, so looking down. Hey, there we go. Looking down from the top at about 2.5 feet, and you'll see these two large areas up here that are about 6 by 4 feet right there. What's very instructive to me is looking at them. You see, this is a view of them in profile, so pretend like you're underground looking sideways at the radar. What we have here are these two very large, very straight-walled anomalies right there that look like they were probably dug out by humans. I believe these are areas that are worth testing further. They're certainly not big enough to hold 67 or 68 individuals, but I think it is a good area to potentially start with. One of the things that we want to do is do a little bit more work in this area, a little further in, when the leaf cover is down and there's not many people around. I'm going to spend most of what I have left talking about Oaklawn. We've split it up, for the purpose of this talk, we've split the area up into 6 different locations. The first one is the Clyde Eddy area and a long extension along the fence line. The second one is the original 18 area here. We went ahead and did the southwest corner. We have the Sexton area here, the bike path next to the IDL, and part of the paved road up in here. And so I'll go through each of these individually and outline our results from here. The first one I'll talk about is the bike path. We wanted to do the bike path because it was close as we could get to the IDL. As I mentioned in some of the media appearances I did before, we aren't able to do any survey on top of the IDL because our radar can't punch through it, in part because of how tall it is, and in part because of all the steel girders and beams and rebar and stuff all down in that area. So we wanted to get right up next to it as best we could. So here's just a shot of us laying the initial grid out. We went all the way up around the corner here. We didn't really find a whole lot. The biggest anomaly we found is right here. That's a pipe associated with a culvert that's somewhere right in there, I think. We did have a couple of little anomalies that showed up with the radar, but they They weren't significant enough to make us think there was anything there. They were very small. Usually we were looking for a larger anomaly that could be a grave. Way back up again. For radar, what we do is we collect in a sequential pattern like you're mowing the lawn. And when you're looking for an anomaly like a grave, you need to see an anomaly in more than one pass. So you want to see 3 or 4, so it's about the right size for a body. Every single one of these anomalies we found was just in one pass, so it's probably just one rock or something like that. Just wasn't enough for us to really say that that's what any of this stuff was. So no luck there. The paved road, here's a shot of it. This is a pretty typical shot of pretty much the entire bit of the paved road. We have the base of the asphalt at the top and not a whole lot underneath it. Here's an example of just a crack in the asphalt as we drove over it. So this is a typical profile for the entire roadway, so not much showed up in that area either. The Clyde Eddy area, we were not able to use gradiometry in this area because it's too close to that metal fence and it would blow out all of our data. We were able to use electrical resistance and radar. We were not able to relocate the Eddy, the anomaly that was reported in 1998. I think we just barely missed it. I think one of the things we have to do is go back to this area and look one more time. A little bit further to the north over here. I think we just didn't quite get it. Both with resistance and the radar, however, we did identify 3 unmarked graves in this area. Here's an example of one of them, where we see one of these low parabolas. We caught that in 4 different passes, so it looks pretty promising that it is an unmarked grave of some sort. Whether or not this is associated with the massacre is not really clear at this point, but we do have a couple of those. And this is an example of what one of the metal headstones on the surface looks like. So we were able to pick up some anomalies, but not the one that Mr. Eddy reported. But like I said, that's one thing we want to do is go back and just preview a little bit of this area and a little further north and see if we can hit that one. So the southwest corner, right down here, this area was surveyed the last time around in 1998, and not a whole lot was found. We wanted to hit it again while we were there because our equipment's a little bit better. Our results were about the same. There are some magnetic anomalies here, but the signatures on them aren't really high enough to be a grave. There are some known graves on the edges here. That's an area where there's a tree, but here's an area where there's a couple of headstones. That dark patch right there indicates that there is a body at that location, but that's one we already knew about. We did not find any indication of any new burials in that area. The Original 18, this is the area that we actually we're willing to go as far as we can and say there are a lot of anomalies here that are very consistent with graves. It appears that the idea that there are maybe 18 people buried in this location is accurate. We have Eddie Lockhart's grave right here. All these darker areas in a circle right here. Some of these are associated with known graves up here, but those are very consistent with what looks like burial to us in the magnetic results. And if you look at the resistance result, that dark patch right in there corresponds with this area in the same place. So we have evidence from 2 different pieces of technology that there very likely are graves in this area. The radar results, we do have a couple of them that we were able to confirm. Here's one example of one from the southern corner here. Those little parabolas right in there. We didn't have a whole lot of luck confirming everything with radar in this location, in part maybe because they're fairly ephemeral. They're probably not in a large coffin or anything like that. But also we had a lot of interference from this big tree that's right there. These are the roots. Oops. These are the roots sort of falling out. You can see it on the top, so that sort of caused us a little bit of noise that we didn't anticipate. But with the other 2 pieces of technology, we do have things that look like they very well might be graves. The Sexton area is probably the most interesting as far as our discussion here tonight is going to center on. We have 2 anomalies to discuss in general. The first is this long horizontal area right here. It stretches probably from me to the edge of the stage. It really looks like it might be a trench in the horizontal view, which is what you see there on the right. But in profile, it's not very pronounced. It does appear in a bunch of different areas, but it's not super pronounced. It doesn't appear to be very substantial. I think it's worth potentially taking another look at it, maybe testing it a little bit, but it's not as strong as evidence as I'd like to believe, but just because it showed up so strongly here, I want to make sure that I brought it to people's attention. Probably the most interesting thing we see here is in this northern section right up in the corner by the road. You see this very large magnetic anomaly up here. It's about 30 feet this way and maybe about 25 out this way. This is a location where there's a sinkhole that's already out there. It's got a sawhorse on top of it. And we have a couple other anomalies down on the bottom here. This one does not turn up at all on the radar. I'm not sure what to make of that one. It just doesn't appear to be, it's just a piece of metal, I think. And a couple other areas over here that may or may not be associated with some of the known graves that are down in here. But I want to go back and focus on this particular area here. Here it is in the radar results. Again, you can see it's very, very large on the surface. But what really strikes me is, first of all, the size of it, but also if you look, you see this very straight, I'm not allowed to drive this thing apparently, very straight walls, very abrupt. This very much looks to me like a human dug pit of some sort. The size of it is very indicative of what could be a common grave associated with the massacre. It's the leading candidate I've seen. I sent some of this data off to a colleague of mine who works for the company that builds the radar. He also agrees with me that it's a very likely candidate to be a mass burial associated with the massacre. I think it's definitely something that needs to be investigated further. I don't ever come out and directly say what I think, if I think something's accurate, because like I said at the beginning, you need the ground truth to be actually 100% sure. But I'm as confident as I can be in the results that this is a very good candidate for something associated with the massacre. If you compare the results between the magnetic results and the GPR results, the size really bears out. Having this showing up in more than one technology is another sort of line of evidence that it's probably something we're looking for. We do have a little bit of electrical resistance data from this area, but it's not particularly convincing. We were having some trouble with power lines and things that day. If you look at it fairly closely, you can make out an area that might correspond to this in size, but it's very difficult to see, so I didn't bother to put it up there. Sort of sum things up. New block, I think, is clean. I don't think there's anything there worth searching for anymore. Going to the caves, we have those two areas that may be burials. They could be associated with the photographs that Scott was talking about. They could just be somebody else who got buried out there, or they could be something we're not looking for at all, but I think they are probably worth taking a look at. And then again, the big one for me is going to be this thing, which I think is a very likely candidate for further exploration. It's about as like I said, about as confident as I can get that this is actually what kind of thing we're looking for in association with this project.
Scott, thank you first of all for what you just presented. Very, very profound. Back to the one that you said was pipes.
Yeah.
Like pipes. Can I just see that again? Because it looked like there were some gaps, and maybe I just hadn't seen pipes for a while, but those gaps in between.
Right in here.
I don't know if pipes have those type of gaps.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking is it could be a ditch that got backfilled or an area where a pipe got something
But
taken
it
out
could
of
be a
it.
person also.
Well, it could be, but it's so large. I mean, that's the thing is, this being 60 feet, it'd be a really big.
It just, if it was a pipe, I would think it'd be long continuous, but to see those gaps kind of like in between.
Well, part of the problem too is, again, like I mentioned, we're having, with all this interference, with all this striping that's being caused here. If you look at it in the radar, it's a little bit more continuous. It's got some gaps in it here, but that's sort of the nature of it, the way this data looks.
Can I ask that? On the Sexton side, what are the dimensions of that trench that you're talking about?
The large anomaly or
The large one?
it's roughly 30 by 25 feet.
30 by 20?
Yeah. It's an estimate, but close.
Is there,
And this may be getting out ahead of things.
So 30 to 25 feet.
Yeah.
This may be, feel free to say you don't want to answer it, but you all have done this kind of work in other places. When we're talking about a trench that's 30 by 25 feet, just be blunt. What kind of body count are we talking about in a trench of that size? If that's what it is.
I don't know if we can come close to answering that question.
But we can't know.
Oh, I know you can't know. I'm not asking you to definitively say, but just, is that 5 people, 300 people?
I'm not an archaeologist, but I'll stick my neck out. You could easily put 100 people in that area like that without any trouble. But again, we don't know, which is a good segue just for a second to Phoebe Stubblefield, member of our committee, who is going to give us a few more words and then also present some of our recommendations.
I will say that both my report and these slides are going to be publicly available after this meeting. So I think they're on the city's website, right? Yeah. So you'll be able to look at these in more detail. And you know, if you want to talk about it further, by all means, let's chat.
And so one of the key questions for us tonight is whether or not we see evidence and analysis tonight that tells us that it merits looking into a phase 2 at particular sites. And it sounds like from your presentation, the answer to that is yes.
The answer to that is definitely yes.
Definitely yes.
Yes, and Phoebe's going to talk about it a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield. I work at the University of Florida. I'm a forensic anthropologist for the University of Florida. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about our recommendations from the committee, the Physical Evidence Committee. But I want to thank the Public Oversight Committee again for your efforts in this. It truly is uplifting, if you can apply that term to a death investigation, uplifting for me to see the public support for this event now compared to 20 years ago. So I do thank the committee, and I thank all of you in the general public for your investment in this activity. I think finally we will reach some level of resolution, but I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So we as a committee, the Physical Evidence Committee, we drew up some recommendations for how to proceed. I won't go in order because I want to address the mayor's query about how many individuals might be buried in a feature that's about, 25 by 30-ish. So you could make some assumptions. So you could say that each individual is laid out there nicely, no overlapping, so shoulder to shoulder, and everyone's facing the same way. So maybe there's about 10. And then you could say maybe they did head to foot to try and fit more people in. So, maybe 12, 15. Or you could throw out the polite version and just say they were discarded and packed in there. And that could be, the end is unknowable. I'm sure it's not, maybe it's not infinite, right? But I would expect, say, 10, but we may be reasonably looking at the first burial site. And by that I mean, keep in mind that if you were responding to a mass disaster now, you respond to those because this is Tornado Alley. But let's say there's a similar event in the summer heat, and instead of letting families deal with their loved ones, you were similarly faced with how to prioritize burials. So the first round is going to be people that you're picking up in public. So that's round 1, and where do you bury them? Remember, this is my opinion, this part. This isn't the entire committee because we argued about this. But in round 1, you bury the people that are obviously located in the place where you bury people, cemeteries. So round 2, where you're going, say, door to door and doing more intensive recoveries, and there's more decomposition involved, and the clock is truly ticking, where do you bury people after you've already perhaps maxed out your cemetery space? The usable space, the space isn't going to cause digging up someone already buried. Well, the Caves area is a good candidate. It needs a little more research, or a little more surveying, but it's a good candidate. I'm smiling because survey is a technical term. I'm an anthropologist, I have to say survey, not scan. But at any rate, the Caves area needs more surveying because it has another risk involved in it that speaks to one of our recommendations as a committee. but it's got a history, it is hearsay for us, but it's based on a good description of a photograph, and it's near a rail line, which is a good way to transport a large number of bodies all at once to a location remote enough where you could, instead of bury or inter formally, you could dispose. And that is a priority if you're throwing people out as opposed to burying them. So realistically, and I'm speaking as a forensic scientist that has to deal with a lot of discarded people, that's what makes the Canes attractive as a site. But the end, the actual count, that number, what do we base it on? So realistically, I would prepare for, tens of people, not necessarily hundreds, but tens of people for this kind of recovery. So as a committee, we drew up some recommendations. We're very interested in both the Canes and the Oak Lawn sites, and we recommend that they be further protected, at least as best as is necessary to maintain them as secure sites, sites that we want to examine intensively in the future. That's our first recommendation, secure those sites. I'm not saying something will happen to them, but they are of interest. And so that gets to our next plan is we as a committee, we need to put together, and I know this will sound like more paperwork, but please bear with me, but we need a feasibility plan. And we've already started talking about it. I came here tonight after looking up what the Oklahoma State Code is regarding disturbing cemeteries. And there's a ritual involved, let's say that, and it involves paper. And then we have the additional problem with the Canes is not a cemetery. And it currently is a homeless camp. Now, in my experience with homeless camps, sometimes you bury people there, your friends, and you don't tell anyone. And we have two small features there. So my concern is we'll excavate it looking for massacre victims and find more recent victims. So in our feasibility plan, we're modeling some interaction between my efforts to recover massacre dead, plus staying in touch with the medical examiner's office and their interactions, because they do have an investment. Our medical examiner system has an investment, but they are taxed with the current load of death investigation. So, but they have to stay involved because technically, once we start digging, we encounter remains of whatever context they have, and then we determine the context when we examine them. So we have to have a plan that will let us respond to the context of remains, whatever the context is, and do that in a way where we're organized such that we don't have remains left at the end of the day. Because my goal for any remains recovered, my goal, the Physical Evidence Committee's goal, we are united in this. Our goal is that this exercise result in, even if the individuals we find are never ID'd by name, because there has been a century, we want them to be reinterred respectfully and not end up in a museum somewhere on a shelf, not in examination. So I'm talking about a time period of, real-time analysis time period of months leading to years, but not multiple years. It depends on the sites and how easy the sites are to excavate and how well we can plan what we want to do with them. So by that I mean our feasibility plan will involve further surveying of the sites that we are interested in, Oak Lawn and the Canes, perhaps surveying of other sites as you tell us about other sites, the general public does, but then the excavation, any excavation we do, any analysis that we do, and then the final disposition. The plan has to have all of those components in there. And we cannot start any kind of extraction of remains or even an intensive survey, meaning, sampling of some of these features. We can't do any of that without a plan for reinterring or encrypting or otherwise, I mean, sticking encrypt, not coding them, but otherwise providing a resolution for any remains we find. Because keep in mind, you know, cemeteries are places where, I mean, you bury people, but we may get out the forensic road grader, clean off the top of the area, find boundaries, and go, okay, this feature really is a large grave feature, even if we haven't dug beneath yet, we see boundaries. But then we look in the backfield from the road grader and we go, oh, there's infant bones in there, or oh, we've got a leg, or some fragment of something that we didn't anticipate, because cemeteries can be like that. So our plan has to include how we deal with people that we didn't expect to find, and people who aren't associated with this event. We're really looking for signs of trauma to help us associate remains with the race massacre. But one of our concerns is that the feature in Oak Lawn in particular might be really well, we just really don't know. A, are there remains in it? B, are they remains from the massacre? Are they from, say, the Spanish influenza event earlier? So we have to be prepared with the response, because if they are from a different event, we have to have a plan ready to reinter them or just leave them there. Because we're not going to just pull up bones for analysis just because I like to analyze bones. So we have a few more recommendations. So we're technically already talking, we've already spoken about this internally, but if the Public Oversight Committee charges us, we will go on to try and get permits, the required approvals for proceeding with any level of excavation, so the cemetery versus the kind of land the Canes is, versus any other features that we find in future surveying. I had mentioned that we'll try to get, we recommend doing the low impact sampling of these features to see if there are remains associated with them. Then we want to finish some of the geophysical survey work, get the Booker T. Washington Rolling Oaks Burial Park survey, and then do some extensions on the Canes and Oak Lawn, especially the Clyde Eddy site, because we had a revelation earlier today that we just missed it by that much. So it needs to be surveyed again. And then, no, that looks like all 6 of them actually. So those are our recommendations going forward as far as future analysis. I just want to remind everyone, these features they do look very good to me. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a forensic anthropologist, but I work with archaeologists all the time on burials. They do look good, but we don't know what's underneath. So please bear with our further investigations, because we don't know what the preservation will be like. And even if the preservation is truly excellent, we don't know who we'll find in there. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you want to
Hold on.
Thank you. You mentioned that you want to preserve the 2 sites, Canes and the Oak Lawn sites. What methods would you use to do that? What would be the best practices for doing that? If you do it, that's basically what you plan to do, is that correct?
We want to make sure they're secure. We don't, as a committee, we didn't want to say, hey, put 24-hour security on them, but the Canes in particular is relatively remote. I mean, Oak Lawn it has a fence, it's a cemetery, but we want to have whatever means are feasible to keep them inspected at a rate that if someone decides to go add or subtract from the area, we would know.
And you probably answered this question already though, but are you saying that there's a possibility that you have also found maybe coffins, or is that a possibility as well?
That's a Scott. But the answer is mostly no, but.
No?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Just 2 questions. One, the sites that you mentioned that had not been surveyed, a timeline for that. And 2, Scott, Is it possible? Because I just don't, I'm not used to seeing pipes with gaps. Can we look at maybe a sewer line map of that area to see if there's something that may shed light to what you stated on that, those being pipes versus files?
Sure, well, the first answer to the first question is the more survey work. We're hoping to do that sometime by February. We could get it done sooner rather than later while we've got the ball rolling. And I can certainly take a little closer look at the data. I didn't put up a lot of the individual radar profiles from New Block, but again, like I mentioned, we looked for sequential parabolas which look like graves, and I really didn't see anything like that. But I'd be happy to go through one more time and take a look to satisfy you if that's okay.
Hi. I keep hearing that this is a crime scene. I keep hearing it, and I know these are murdered victims. At what point is this truly labeled a crime scene? And being labeled a crime scene, does that mean that we still have to go through all the permits and paperwork to start the excavations?
So I spoke to the anthropologists that work with the medical examiner's office and the two offices in Oklahoma. This is, from their perspective, a forensic investigation. But yes, we still have to go through the paperwork. And I asked them because the cemetery, Oak Lawn, is a cemetery, and there are more clearly defined rules for getting permission to alter or disinter people. And because these are unknown individuals, they immediately are subject to the medical examiner's purview. The Canes, it was still more on the search warrant level of we need a search warrant to go and excavate. So in technically both circumstances involve a judge and explaining to a judge what we want to do and what the variety of outcomes we expect. Like I would tell a judge, we want to do a search in Oak Lawn, and we are looking for these features and these coordinates based on our geophysical survey. And if we encounter it remains before we get to the depth of burial, we have this plan that they're not included in our analysis, and then we'll keep digging, and I expect the judge will grant that. But, so it's still a judge, but part of your question is about the murder investigation part, and that's trickier because murder, yes, but it's an historical investigation. So in the sense that, will we find, let's say these are massacre dead, and we disinterred them, find trauma, we document it, we can say, this male of such and such age, or such and such height, with this ancestry, had a gunshot wound or defect to his cranium, entrance, exit, we can describe all that, but he won't get a name, and so we can't put a name on the death certificate. And there's definitely no assailant because everyone's passed by now. So we can document everything for the truth of what occurred. They're not invisible victims, they're actual real victims. They just don't get names. They're individual, male, whatever we decide to designate them by. But the probability of giving them names, very, very difficult, low probability. So that part of a murder investigation, that part where you say, I want to see, I really want to have the jury convene, that kind of aspect of a murder. No, because too much time has passed. So yes, it won't speed up our investigation technically because it's still the same process, get the judge to approve the search. But then we have other issues like I won't pursue that unless we know what we'll do with any remains found. That doesn't involve sitting on a shelf.
I have a question. In regards to Oak Lawn Cemetery, was that cemetery city owned? And 1921, and based on what we just saw, like, who would have commissioned that sort of burial at a city-owned cemetery?
Well, you know, the city was placed under martial law by the end of June 1st. And so in a sense, the military authorities would have been in control, but the power didn't always work that way. Certainly the sexton at Feely at Oaklawn Cemetery would have simply been informed by the mayor, by the head of the National Guard, by other authorities that we will be burying, massacre victims there. But beyond that, one issue here is that there aren't records. There aren't written records, written directives. We found, nothing of that line to be able to make a connection like that. So I guess the bottom line is I can't tell you.
Mr. Ellsworth, you mentioned something earlier about ICE. Could you repeat that statement about ICE?
Yes, so this was part of, this is a hypothesis as well. But Betsy Warner discovered in how many tons? 10 tons. The county purchased 9 tons of ice from an ice plant that was located not far from downtown, not far from New Block or the Canes. You can go through the county ledgers and you don't see ice purchases like that at all. That really struck us. And our conjecture is as these bodies are out on that sandbar, maybe they're trying to use ice or on railroad cars or on flatbed trucks to slow the decomposition until they figure out where they're going to bury them. But that's just a hypothesis.
Okay, that coincides with 2 testimonies that I have. One was that bodies were taken west, specifically to Oklahoma University, and this statement about ICE confirms what I've heard about bodies, the cadavers being used at OU Medical School. So it strikes me too, that this mention of so much ice, and I have another testimony that we wouldn't find any bodies because they were all shipped out on the train going west. So that concerns me. The other thing...
And just can I say, I would love to talk to you afterwards and share the source of all of that.
Sure.
And anyone out there, if you have information, we are all ears, believe me.
The other question I have, or comment I have, is I think we need to be careful about marginalizing possibilities. And I say that because in 1928, there was a hurricane in Florida, and there was a mass grave, probably half the size of the one that Scott mentioned. It's 70 by 30, and they had 674 bodies in that mass grave. So I think we need to be very cautious about making assumptions of low ball numbers. We've heard so much and gotten so much testimony about the number of bodies that were actually, just looking at the number of people missing, just doing common sense deduction, it's a serious atrocity. The other thing I think we need to do, because it is a crime scene, we need to take heed to the tips and the information that we get, everything, like literally everything. Because I looked at that and I said, okay, if I was involved in the massacre at that time period, it makes sense to me to put the bodies where nobody would ever look, right? As opposed to dismissing that they would have never put them there because that's a Jim Crow area. But it actually makes sense to put them there because nobody's ever gonna look in that location. And to Scott, what are the odds? I'm sorry, archaeologist Scott. What are the odds that the bodies are there but have decomposed dramatically?
Yeah, that's probably more of a Phoebe question, actually.
In the century, there will probably be some kind of remains left, but it really depends on the type of soil, how acidic the soil is there. So we won't know until we do it. Some parts of Oklahoma have very good preservation, so bones are preserved in their shape. And I would expect to get skeletal material and things like buttons or clothing artifacts if the individuals were buried with clothing artifacts. But other parts of Oklahoma are akin to the conditions I see in Florida, where the groundwater is acidic and the bones are eaten away. And just over time and compression, skeletons, they are they're hard tissues. So we really just won't know what level of preservation we'll get, because we may have, say, many long bones preserved, and then things like the pelvic girdles and craniums crushed from compression. That's a typical burial outcome. Or we may have, because we don't know how people were, if they're interred people, we don't know how they were buried. So say if your model of a dense burial is correct, then the amount of commingling and compression will cause much more breakage. And so the more you break the bones, the lower the preservation rate, because the water gets in, and so you have more decay. So it really just depends on what state they were in when they were put in. If they're severely burned going in, some bones will still be more preserved than others. It really just depends on what we start with. So I hope we'll find out.
My final question for Scott Hammerstead. Could you pull up the photo again of Oakline where you found the large, there's the Sexton area near the road on the west end? Could you go back to the actual photo?
Which photo?
There you go, right there.
Oh, this.
Could you point out where that area is that has the large, 30 by...
Oh, large, it's right up in here.
So it's right against the road?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Okay, so that coincides with the testimony we got from the former, the grandson of the former caretaker of Oakline Cemetery, who stated that a trench was dug where that road is located, and it coincides. I'm just looking at this and looking at the similarities, or the evidence, better yet, looking at the evidence of how that coincides. We also have a testimony from one of the city's first concrete company owner. The family owned this first concrete company. They also testified that a trench was dug in that location, because at that time there was the Midland Valley tracks, not the highway. And if we look at the old map from 1921, which needs to be next to that one, so that we can have we can really identify what we're looking at from 21 versus 2019. It makes a huge difference on how the community can interpret your findings and the area that this is actually located in, so that we can, because we owe it, we have to do our due diligence to give homage to these ancestors and make sure that these bones are recovered.
Dr. Phoebe, I wanted to say, when you mentioned that nothing will be done until we know, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not going to quote you word for word, but paraphrasing, nothing will be done until we know a place for sure where the bodies will be interned, and not just on some shelf in a museum. I've offered to the mayor in private meetings that the grassy area of Vernon, the only part of the original Greenwood, I don't count Gap Band Road, but the original Greenwood that's still owned by African Americans, historic Vernon, we would be more than happy to have the bodies and remains interned there. In fact, in partnership with the Tulsa Community Remembrance Project, we're planning to have a huge memorial for that as well. So don't even let that be a concern. If it's okay with all parties that need to be involved in it, we'll be more than honored to do that. So I want to make sure that was addressed. Secondly, when people come to members of the media, Chief just hit on the fact that the ground that has the most prominence is the point. It was pointed out to me and a few others from a grandson of a caretaker. I wasn't the first person he came to. He actually came to several members of the media, but nobody paid attention to his story. And so I say this not to you all, but to those that are around me and behind me. This is so serious. And when people share information, none of it should be ignored. This man was ignored for years, but thankfully, due to his and others' testimony, you all, and I appreciate you all for paying attention to what we share with you, and I'm prayerful that something will be found.
Was understanding that this work has been done, we mentioned Booker Washington, the cemetery, and want to know where are we on that in terms of there was possibly going to be some research done there?
I may need to turn this over to the deputy mayor. Amy, would you mind giving an update to people on what you know? My understanding is that is going to happen. We certainly plan on doing it.
So, as Phoebe mentioned, in order to investigate without the property owner's permission, we would need a judge to execute a search order, which we do not have. We also do not have the property owner's permission yet. So we are continuing to have discussions about the property owner giving the city permission to do that work, and we'll keep you updated, but we don't have it yet.
So I've got a question. If there's no statute of limitations on murder, and if we're considering this to be a potential crime scene, why have we then not pursued this more aggressively as a city body? And why is it taking so much time? When does the owner of this potential crime scene get to tell the city when and where we get to look?
I cannot speak on behalf of the owner. The owner is represented by an independent legal counsel who is the contact to answer those questions, and we can share that contact information. From the city perspective, in order to obtain a search warrant, we would really need to be able to meet all of that criteria that Phoebe mentioned earlier. We need a really exact location that we can back up with evidence. We need a plan for how we would investigate and a plan for what we would do with what we find. So that's not out of the realm of possibility. We're just not there yet.
So I don't really need the contact information of the owner. What we need is contact with the city officials, that's who we are, we represent the state. And I think we would supersede any owner as it relates to a potential crime scene. So I'm a little concerned about the lack of aggressiveness that's taking place as it relates to Booker T. And also, we've talked specifically about Crown Hill. So as the folks that are supposed to be the oversight committee, it's been more like undersight, because sometimes we don't get information that we've been asking for. And we've asked in private meetings, we've asked in public meetings, and we still keep going months and months down the road. I don't know what information have we not gotten. Well, as most specifically tonight, I did not know why we had not gone out to Booker T. Washington Cemetery, which was one of the areas that we were going to be looking into. So it's not. What was the answer, Mayor?
The delay is a recognition of the difference in the nature of the property ownership. So 3 of the locations of the 4 that we talked about tonight, the city owns them. So we can go in, we have ownership of it, any damage occurs at that site during the course of the investigation, the city's responsible for taking care of that, we own up to that, we did that. This is a private, and I apologize for the feedback, this is a private piece of property. The discussions we've had with the owner today have not been an objection to do it. It's simply that he wants to know in a densely packed cemetery, if during the course of any work that's done, if there's damage to other people's headstones or burial plots, who's going to take care of that? And so the city, unfortunately, there's a law that we can't indemnify state authorities for working on that. Maybe we can work with you to fix that issue. But to be totally clear, I mean, we will do a scan in that site. And if we have to pursue a court order, we will do that.
Well, maybe we would suggest
if we can get it,
because
if we can get it
we
with
give
the-
deference to the owner, and if it's
Just trying to be a good neighbor and work through
But
it.
months and months, Mayor, what we're saying is that years ago, 20 years ago.
Oh, I can't talk.
I'm not asking you to speak
Go back
what I'm
to the
saying
door
to
and
you.
fix it.
I'm not asking you to fix anything. What I'm asking you to do, and I'm asking what we should be doing as a body, is be more intentional and aggressive in saying to that owner, right? Actually, we do have oversight. And actually, if it's a crime scene or a potential crime scene, we don't give deference to the owner of a private facility or a private residence. And I don't know when we've done that. So I'm just,
The
Mayor,
problem is with the crime scene being 98 years old, the threshold and the challenge for us to get that judicial order is much higher than if it were a crime scene from a week ago. And so, trust me, I share your frustration. I completely agree with you. But I do want you to know that I'm just gonna talk to you.
No, go ahead.
How's that?
It's because the other one's on.
Does that work? Okay, it's kind of awkward, but, all right. I completely share your frustration, but I want you to know, this is not an issue of a lack of urgency or aggressiveness. It is simply that if we can work through this privately with the owner, we believe we can get in there and do the work quicker than if we were gonna have to put together a case and get it judicial. So, we're gonna, yeah.
I want to encourage all of us to take a moment of perspective. I've been watching this for 20 years, not as long as Scott has. But at any rate, not as long, but in 20 years, we have in 1 year made so much more progress than we were able to as a committee 20 years ago. And I want to encourage everyone, hold on to that progress. There's no need to violate the law now to pursue a past violation of the law. And we have a real legal hurdle because, I mean, if you've lived from the perspective of having your rights not met or violated, I understand that approach, but the landowner, I mean, just the general approach to the idea of, isn't this a crime scene? Can't we go in and can't we get a search warrant? No, because it is an old crime scene and we have to justify disturbing that area first. So we go to the judge with the reasonable information, but what is our reasonable information? Well, usually it would be like an informant or some other search, a survey, like say our survey results for Oblong might easily result in a judge giving us permission to disturb a cemetery, which had, a legal procedure. But to investigate a landowner's old, very old burials where people have spent money to inter their loved ones on top of burials, in urn burials. And if you visit Rolling Oaks, it has a lot of interments. Some of them are military, some of them are their urn burials, and for even military remains, I wouldn't go in there willy-nilly moving things around unless I had the support of the legal community. But
Are you saying that your scan machine has already been out?
not to Rolling Oaks.
So would your scanning machine interfere with cemeteries that are already there? Because I'm confused, these places that you've been, it seems like you're saying, the scanning machines, the 3 different pieces of equipment you had to do things. I didn't hear you say anything about digging anything or moving anything. I'm trying to understand. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, are you saying that with those 3 pieces of equipment that you got these deals up here, are you saying that you can't go to this privately owned sites because these 3 pieces of equipment will overturn things or disturb graves? I'm getting a little confused.
No, you're fine, and I have to admit, after visiting Rolling Oaks, there's a chance we wouldn't even notice because it's a little disorganized looking, but they're above ground monuments. And some of them are like the little vases where you put flowers in and it's just a marker and a monument, vase holder, flower holder. But we can't disturb those dragging the magnetometer over them. We have to have, as the landowner wants, we have to have a strategy for if we disturb anything, say we step on an urn burial and it gives way and we crushed it or bent the marker, or because there were markers tucked in the earth, and I had no idea the amount of burials that are in the location that the witnesses pointed to now. And while they're shallow, you know, they're probably only a few feet deep, like 1 or 2 feet deep. They're not going to disturb potential older burials, so it is a great economic strategy for using cemetery. But it's a little chaotic. And so we do our orderly dragging of the magnetometer, mainly the magnetometer probably, but that's a Scott question. Through there, we will run over features that we have to say, how will we repair it? Because if I were the family member and I came through there later and found, I'd like to say more chaos, but go visit and you'll see what I mean. I would look to the city as a source of why is my marker bent in half or stepped in or the vase broken. And even though anyone could have done it, I knew the city was out there serving. So we had to have a plan first.
And let me just say this, I'm passing the mic. It is nowhere lost on me the work that's been done in the last few months. My asking questions is no way taken away from what's being done. What we are saying, though, as we proceed further, we're not going to forget what we said to the public. We're not going to forget what was determined 20 years ago, and that's just a fair question.
No, your question is valid, and I wasn't trying to imply you can't have a voice or ask your question, because I learned from you. Like, I consider every time someone says, what about this site? In my world, they're all viable sites, because they could be different strategies in the long-term recovery of bodies from that massacre. So when someone says, what about remains that went to OU? Oh, that is smart, because that could have happened. And, or remains buried in another location. Yeah, if one individual saw a few bodies disposed of, then that's part of this event. And we may be prioritizing recoveries, but all the stories, all the accounts of recoveries are true. So I'm not trying to discourage you from having a question. I want to just make sure we keep our focus on, well, I mean, I just want to point out my focus on, we have made great progress. We just have. Thank you all of you, actually, because without you guys, we wouldn't have made this progress.
I would like to, when you said that the owner of the Booker T. Washington Cemetery is worried that things might be disturbed, like grave markers and urns and things of that sort. I'm kind of curious at that, because I've been studying that area since 2004 when I wrote the story. And then I got photographs of that area over the years. And it wasn't until recently, those tombstones, those markers, they all been taken up. Maybe like 3 or 4 of them that were handmade tombstones are still there in their place, and a couple of military tombstones that are out there. But there were temporary markers that was in place. They were planted like corn in rows out there. All those markers have been pulled up. Isn't that a crime scene? Yeah, not to mention that a lot of that disturbance came when they created the village of Ashton Creek out there.
And well, I won't speak to exact Oklahoma law, but considering that people, they have their loved ones interred in a known way with known markers and known locations, yes, altering that is not appropriate. Notice I didn't say criminal, because I'm going to let the lawyer speak to that, for the state. But that circumstance would also make me think the landowner may want to be cautious in having more surveying occur. But, I hear what you're saying, and it just makes me go, yes, let's have the city negotiate a clear position before we go into doing the survey.
It seems like they're trying to, cover their butt in the situation, because they definitely disturbed that area over the years. And the last time I was out there past spring, I saw this whole area just totally the lawn crips that were out there. There were things that were in place that I've been watching this area for over a decade. I'm seeing just recently, since the announcement of this committee and what we're trying to do, I've seen it just totally change, totally removed. Even some that had names on them, they were removed. I got pictures of that. And so, isn't that a crime? Nobody's answering that.
Yes, it's a felony.
Well, Marco,
Yes.
let's dig.
At our last meeting at Vernon, that was in the physical investigation committee, a note about some evidence that the city of Tulsa Police Department had. And I think Scott Hammerstead, you mentioned something about a cardboard box also with pictures in it. Has there been any effort since our last meeting in recovering evidence that was collected by our city police department and in the possession of our city police department as recent as I believe in the 1970s? Because that is crucial in matters such as trying to find where the bodies could have been possibly dumped, and crucially in culpability of who actually was involved in doing it.
Well, I can tell you what I've done and what results have or have not happened. As soon as the Robert Patty account I was reminded of that by Betsy Warner, and it became clear to me that this was potentially very much a legitimate site and a site that we very much needed to pursue. I wrote a letter to the mayor asking him to see if he would ask the police chief and members of the police department to search for two items in particular. One was this box of photographs that Sergeant Cotton allegedly showed to these police officers in 1973. But the other was what may have been a list of riot fatalities that was seen by a police captain in the 1960s, late 1960s, that Ed Wheeler heard about. I also heard about in the 1970s as well too, a typescript list of allegedly names or maybe of simply individuals. And we asked to find that. I sent the mayor a letter asking him to ask the police chief, and to my knowledge that was sent as far as I know. And I've received nothing back to say that you let him speak. I can't remember. I was either told we haven't been able to find anything or nothing was found or whatnot. Go ahead.
The department looked, but that story was from 45 years ago, and they could not find anything matching what was described.
I will say along those lines, Reverend Turner, and the audience as well too, I'm certainly more than willing and very interested in working with the members of the Tulsa Police Department who deal with records and have old case files. I would like to see that if I could get access to those rooms and to see for myself whether there might be things there. So that's a request I would certainly make.
Is there anything we can do as a committee to give you that access? Because to me, that information is very vital to the success of any investigation. And the fact that the Tulsa Police Department, 1973, had it, was in possession of critical evidence.
Or at least Sergeant Carver.
At least Sergeant, who was a sergeant of the Tulsa Police Department, had possession of critical evidence. And now today, nobody can find it. To me, that is very suspicious, if not criminal, to be just discarding of evidence. And so I think that that's even more reason why we need to be, and I'm harping on the letter I just read, which I support, very instrumental in whoever this new police chief is, because that position has some major influence in not just current investigations, but even previous investigation. And so I don't know, and Dr. Phoebe, you mentioned about a feasibility study. I don't know if our rules of order are in place, if we need to offer a motion for the feasibility and for your access, or if that's just the mayor's call. But I think we definitely need to pursue all avenues in this regard.
Well, and I appreciate that support, and I think that, it's certainly welcome to me, and I'm certainly sure that we will pursue that matter as well further.
Arnold Scott, could you enlighten the audience, those who may not know? I understand that your biggest hit was, is that where the gray myrtles are planted in that area? Okay, and I do understand that it's difficulty to search the freeway because all the barbed wire. Scott, could you tell us, give us more information about how the graveyard, no, Dr. Scott, well, okay, Dr. Scott. Scott. Could you tell us,
Sliding the elder. I'm sorry.
Could you give us some background, some history on the length of the Oaklawn Cemetery before the freeway came across it, and then when it was discovered that bodies were covered up over that freeway system?
Well, I don't have a lot of evidence. You can see where there is, if you go, which you have done many times, if you go and look at the iron fence around the west side of Oaklawn Cemetery, it's moving along and then it bends in. So there is an area that has been cut off. I don't know that it's very big, maybe 20 feet on the 11th Street side. It's a triangular area. The issue on the freeway was this: hello? Oh, there we go. I think it's gone again. When the news broke in 1999 that we had. Let me just talk loud. I have teenagers. I can talk.
No, here.
Can you all hear me?
No.
Okay,
No media needs it.
Okay, all right. When the news broke, when Kelly Kurt, who was an AP stringer here in Tulsa, broke the news about our investigation looking for the unmarked burial sites of riot victims, one thing that happened is we were able to place a little box on the front page of the Tulsa World and on the Oklahoma Eagle asking citizens if they had any knowledge whatsoever of riot deaths or locations where riot victims might have been buried, to please contact one of two different groups. One was the Greenwood Cultural Center, which we listed its phone number. The other one was the Tulsa Historical Society. We did that very specifically for the reason that we felt that white informants would be more comfortable speaking to people at a white institution like the Tulsa, Historical Society. Likewise, that African American informants might be more likely to call the Greenwood Cultural Center. We got some calls to the Greenwood Cultural Center, but we got well over 100 calls at the Tulsa Historical Society from members of the white community who finally felt that they had a safe place to tell their story. And we got a lot of valuable information from that. But the one story that has resonated with this freeway thing is I got a call. It was from a gentleman who would not give his name. He had been a construction worker when that interdispersal loop was built in 1972. And he claimed that when they were grading or excavating, whatever it was, that they found bones there and that nothing was done about it. I don't know how many bones. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look at my notes as to what he said. He wouldn't tell me his name. I found out nothing beyond that. So in my mind, and it may not be true, but in my mind, that's the origin of the story in my mind as to whether there might be bones that are buried under the freeway or not. Would you like this?
Yes.
Okay, ready?
Thank you for the information you just provided, but I want to go back to the Booker T. Washington Cemetery. It just keeps coming back to me. Several things. Number one, it's a cemetery. Yes, I got that, but it's been a cemetery for a while. But the question keeps coming up about disturbing graves, and those graves were disturbed when they did development. They have new homes that are built around the area. So I want to know, first of all, what are the laws? What are the laws, number one, as it relates to disturbing a cemetery? Actually, Philip, someone can bring me that answer later on today. That would be fun. Okay. But I want to go on record as asking that question so when someone can give a specific answer for that. Number two, we've always known that that was a grave site with possible people from the massacre buried there. There have been homes built around that area. There have been stories that you've mentioned where the graves were disturbed, placards were removed and changed around. Now all of a sudden, the owner of the cemetery has a problem with you bringing a little wagon, basically, it's a wagon, I've seen it, and putting it across the space that needs to be surveyed, okay? It's not sitting right with me right now. We want to play nice, and I understand playing nice, because playing nice, you know, you get a little further, okay? But right now, that is a place where we buried our family, okay? And I just need to know, how long will it take for this owner, talking about the owner of the cemetery, okay? We're talking about the developers that went in and built houses. So we have 3 layers going on here, but all of a sudden we cannot get permission to go and survey the space. I need answers for that, because we've always talked about that space being a burial for, and it's being pushed. So something has to be addressed. And we don't know who the owner of the cemetery is, the connections, the relationships, but we do know it was disturbed before you came along with your radar equipment. Now all of a sudden there's a concern. We don't want to disturb the above ground interments, right? Is that the conversation? Okay.
The urn bearers.
The urn bearers.
Yes.
Those are, I want to, yeah. So I want to put all of that out there so we can address this site, because we have bodies out there that were buried. We don't know who's who, whatever, but we're skipping over the obvious. That site should also be a priority as far as, you know, determining mass graves, people's family. Don't go play over there because we're suspicious, but we respect our ancestors. That's why we don't go play on graves. You don't play in a graveyard. Okay, so that's what, even as now, I was taught that as a child. You don't walk over graves, you don't play in it, you don't do that. So with all of this that has gone on, we still haven't, we can't say, can you take the wagon over there? And no, we can't do that. We don't want to disturb anything now, but we built mansions in the area. I got a problem with that.
There is so the state of Oklahoma has a burial desecration law. So it's Oklahoma Statute 21-1168. And it protects all human remains as burials and their goods. So legally, yes, if there's like say if you're the family member and you go to the marker and it's moved or gone, then you're immediately in a place where you have to go to the funeral, the cemetery owner and say, hey, you've done something fraudulent to me because I bought this space, I put my loved one in it, and now there's no indication of that. So that statute, the burial desecration law, does protect burials in the state, even if they're privately owned cemeteries or publicly owned managed spaces. But as far as pursuing it as a legal manner, that's a procedure of those who've been affected need to, so you know you're missing your family's markers, you need to bring that matter directly forward to, well, usually, I'm usually being business, I'm usually being handled as a business level issue, not a, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it's like Business Affairs. In Florida, the funeral services management is through Business Affairs, so they're the agency that you contact when someone has stolen your markers or moved your loved one and basically not told you. But this date, it may be the same management, it may be another one, but individuals affected need to bring it forward, because I can attest that that particular cemetery is peculiarly organized. And so, but I don't have any loved ones buried there. Mine are in Clearview, so I can't. This is much needed. But at any rate, those markers, if someone's looking for their loved one, well, good luck. You know, it's really peculiar. So they should go forward and say, hey, cemetery owner, can you find my loved one's marker? When they get to run around, then they need to pursue it legally, and all of them together need to pursue it. But the story of homes built, you know, that predates, you know, my activity, and but those do count as cemetery disturbances to bring forward as, hey, you've done something fraudulent for people who have graves there. You know. So, but it does speak to why we probably aren't proceeding straight away to survey Booker T, because there may be some, because I would bet money there's a legal issue, but we need to pursue it either as play nice or as a legal issue. But it'll take longer if we pursue it as a legal issue. So, but I hear your concerns, though, that is, you know, what's going on over there, and why can't we proceed?
I have a question for both Scotts. Because I'm really disturbed that Oakland is off the map. My question is it off because they couldn't find anything? Do we have enough valid testimony or enough information to confirm that that location is valid? We just can't find it based on what is in place there. I'm sorry, not Oakland, but New Block, forgive me, at New Block.
Well, at New Block, again, you know, someone once told me, you know, 20 years ago or lately, that what we were trying to do is to look for a needle in the haystack when you don't know where the haystack is. So this has taken a lot of, even to get close on some of these, has taken a lot of work. There is a huge oral tradition that points us towards New Block Park. There is a huge, and we have eyewitness reports of Tulsa seen bodies heading in that direction. New Block is also close enough to the canes that the term New Block might in fact refer to that larger area as well. The story from Jack Britton, that teenager who you know, ran upon this discovery in 1945, I think we interviewed 25 people about that story, and we ended up finding 5 or 6 individuals who he told that he was dead when we heard the story. But he told that story to different people who did not know him in different decades. And he told a consistent story. And we thought that was powerful. Once we determined that it wasn't the swimming pool from 1927, and Dick Warner made that discovery of the sewage lift pump station, we thought that was good. It was also in a low area. It wouldn't have been visible easily from the houses in Crosby Heights. It just seemed to really fit the bill. And, you know, we were wrong. You know, I mean, at least we think we were wrong at that site. It may be that he saw it somewhere else and we haven't figured out where that is yet.
Okay, so I have a video testimony from a woman whose grandfather used a trolley car loaded with black bodies, as she stated, loaded with black bodies that were taken to New Block Park and dumped on the sandbar.
To the sandbar?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's right behind the water plant. No, where the water plant, the original water plant in New Block, behind the water plant along the river.
Well, it could have been a different sandbar, but anyway, go ahead.
So anyway, and you think about the location of the train tracks, relationship between the train tracks. But I think there's enough evidence and enough story that points there for us to at least, because we're dismissing it at this point, at least put a historical marker there that says this, you know, this has been known to be a historical site where bodies were dumped. And
Well, nobody on this committee is dismissing it at all. We would love to find remains wherever they are. And I guess the one issue, we have a resource issue with only so many funds. That New Block area is a large area. There's a lot of places to look. Also, there's an issue of the levee went in the 1940s and has covered up some of this. But we're certainly in favor of continuing anywhere. Absolutely.
Okay, the last question. Greg Robinson asked a question about who owned the cemetery in 1921. And
The Oak
Lawn,
Okay.
yes. And it concerns, well, it's just a question. If the city of Tulsa owned Oak Lawn Cemetery, why were they built to bury 18 bodies?
They contacted a local funeral home, which became Stanley McCune. I'm not sure what it was called right at the moment. And bodies were probably from hospital. I don't know where the bodies came from, but we know that Stanley McCune built the city or built the county to bury these. The funeral homes would build the county regularly when they were charged with preparing a body, putting it in a coffin that would be buried in the paupers part of the cemetery anyway. So there was an established relationship between these funeral homes and the city or the county in terms of burying. What our big find was to find these ledgers that proved that these were riot victims. There would be a name, cause of death, gunshot wound, or it's this name or that name. We have 13 names, 12 with first and last names. We've done some work on identifying these individuals. We think some of those individuals, and again, we're thinking that that's in that original 18 area. That's where we're thinking, but we don't know. Some of them were buried in coffins, but from what we've been able to tell, the funeral homes in Tulsa ran out of coffins very quickly that week. So that's what we know.
I think at this point, it would, I'm thinking about it in relationship to a crime scene. It would be wise for us to, we almost need to have a discovery of evidence, right? Like file for discoveries of evidence, subpoena people, because people know who these people are, and all these photos that are in the Smithsonian and in the Oklahoma Historical Site, people know who these people are in these photos that are there and present in the burnings and the looting and all these things that are going on. And it's like everybody's held all these meetings to ask the black community to come forward with any stories and information, but we're not getting any reciprocity. There's no reciprocation of information and documents and photos. There's all this hiding of boxes of photos that we find and information that we find. We have to, if we're really going to disclose, if we're really going to disclose this story and find out what's hidden, we're going to have to have some mutual accountability here. Some real support and sharing information, because it's very one-sided. It's very one-sided because you're asking the victim to report everything, but we're not asking the perpetrators to do anything. Or the people who witness, just witnesses. Right, because all the testimonies that I got, even with Oak Lawn, the testimony I got from this family who owned the first concrete company, the Roach family, he flat out said, listen, my father was a very matter-of-fact person, and he said they brought in bodies on flat rail cars on the MK Railroad and dumped them in trenches along that railroad outside of Oak Lawn Cemetery. And he said what hurt my grandfather the most was that there were at least 300 bodies and the National Guard was involved. And I said, do you think your father may have overestimated? He said, oh no, my father was a very matter-of-fact kind of person, and he did not lie. So he was very adamant about the story that was told to him by his grandfather. So when we ask these people to tell their stories, like I'm asking for reciprocity, we have to do our due diligence to give respect to these people who are risking everything, right? Risking their families just like we are by opening up old wounds. We're asking them out of respect, let's pay attention to these stories. I have no idea what kind of stories we have collected since we started this through the City of Tulsa website. And I think as an oversight committee, we need to have access to that information so that we do know what other stories have been told, what other information has been given, so that we can put puzzle pieces together to deal with this conspiracy of silence.
I have a question for Scott the Younger.
That's good.
You mentioned earlier that further work needs to be done at the Canes. You said further work, is that more scanning, is that excavation, what is that look like?
It would be more of the geophysical survey, yeah, more radar work.
And what was there, what is lacking from that first pass that you took that we would need to do in a second pass?
It was mostly that we didn't have a whole lot of time, and so we're only able to do a small area, and also it's overgrown and enough tree cover in there to make it a little bit tricky. So we need to have a little more time and handle better weather conditions.
More time to clear the space and
to extend it out.
Okay.
Some takeaways, because we're doing a lot of going back and forth, and I want to just be clear. The next time we meet, I don't want my ears to hear that we have not gotten the legal permission to survey Booker T. Washington. I don't want my ears to hear that, because we heard that at the last meeting and the meeting before that. The next time we meet, as God is my witness, I don't want my ears to hear that we're still waiting on the Tulsa Police Department to find the pictures from 1973 of the massacre of 1920. I just have a hard time believing in 2019 that it takes this long for information that's already there to come to light, unless there is a cover-up, or unless there is some sort of obstruction. Now, if we're going to be frank, we're going to be frank. If we're trying to do this, we're trying to do this. But what I don't want is for us to lollygag and catfoot, if I was true, that's the word, catfoot around until 2021 to make this some spectacle then when we have within our purview to handle today. And whatever permission or authorization you need, by God, be it so ordered. And if I'm wrong, Mr. Mayor and his team, correct me. If you don't have that authorization, then we need to know. But from my voice to your ears, I don't want to hear that at the next meeting.
This is for Scott. On the end here, yes, you.
Young Scott.
Young Scott, okay, I wasn't saying that. Anywho, I just wanted to ask, concerning Rolling Oaks, we're basically, or what I'm hearing is that the usual scanning devices possibly cannot be utilized at that site. So I'm just kind of wondering, is there any drone technology that could be utilized at this point?
So for the first point, we will be using the same technology.
You will do the same thing, okay.
Yes.
I know there seems to be some concern because of all of the different markers and everything like that.
It'll be logistically hard, a little bit more challenging, but it's still doable. It's just a matter of the land thing. And the drone technology will be difficult because it's in the trees.
Okay.
And my drone doesn't have LiDAR, and so I don't know how well.
Okay, so we're not there yet as far as that.
And I don't know how effective LiDAR would be in that situation anyway. I don't think it would be particularly useful. Yeah, the overlying burials are gonna mess it up.
Okay,
so you
thank
can't
you.
see below it.
I don't have a question, but I have a very short story. Survivor Wes Young, who I got to know, O.S.T. Clark, who I knew. O.S.T. Clark always told the story about when the white mob, came to their home and took his stepfather, who he loved dearly. And he never seen his stepfather after that. Never seen him. And if you ever had O.S.T. Clark to tell you that story and the pain that was in his eyes when he told that story, it breaks your heart. All day today, all I could think of is Otis T. Clark. See, it does something to you when you have met one of the survivors. And I know he gets so deep into the historical investigation. I've just heard that term today. And you forget the people that it affected. And my friend Wes Young, who I met through Chief, he had friends and family that he never seen again. And they died. They died on a pursuit to find their loved ones and hoping to pursue justice. I am carrying their pain, and I am on a pursuit for justice, and I mean that with every being in me. I pray to God that none of this is a cover. I want to believe in my city. I want to believe that my city is going to do the right thing. But I am so conflicted with what I'm hearing today. Deeply conflicted, hurt, because I don't feel that all of us is on a pursuit for justice. I don't feel that. I don't feel that. And it pisses me off.
Thank you, Christy. I wanted to thank you, Christy, and certainly remembering that we do have relatives and ancestors, so we know why we're here. But as we talk about, I think I heard that folks didn't know where they might start at Booker T. Washington Cemetery, and that's laughable because you have a commission report from 20 years ago, Mr. Ellsworth, that you worked on with your name attached to it, and I'm wondering why you have not shared with the audience where work was done then. And I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna read it, okay, since we can't seem to know where to start at Booker T. And it's a beginning, if nothing else, but there's a reason why it was recommended 20 years ago to go there, right? But if it talks about Booker T. Washington, says, with information provided by Scott Ellsworth and Dick Warner, 3 areas at Booker T. Washington Cemetery were selected for GPR study. Soils here differ from those, okay? It talks about Area A, which was roughly 40 meters. It talks about at Area B and Area C. And so it's very descriptive in terms of where folks were looking. But if we started there, and the conclusion was, this is one of 3 areas where we need to focus our sights on possible mass graves, you guys have already done the work. You guys have already looked at some areas that were potential sites. And so for us to say, we just don't know where to go, Booker T, it's such a vast area, I think that the work has already been done, some of it, and I think if we just follow up on that, I think we can kind of hone in on some of the areas where we could be looking. I think just a concerted effort would be appreciated, as opposed to, it's such a big place and we don't know where to start.
Well, I don't know who said they don't know where to start. I mean, we certainly knew what we did 20 years ago, and we presented that to the members of our committee. I can show you at any point exactly where we scanned 20 years ago. It's where we hope to scan now with the better equipment and higher resolution equipment. So I don't think there's any question as to where we would plan to look again now and plan to look again now. So I guess I'm confused on the where to start.
I think, Mr.
Are you talking about New Block or?
No, I'm talking about Booker T. Washington, and when I brought up the issue, I brought up the issue, and there was a question about, you know, we have to kind of know where we want to go, where we want to start. I believe I'm not the only one that heard that in the
Oh, no, that was in reference to New Block Park, not in reference to Booker T. Washington.
Scott, you mentioned the testimony of Doug Hammerstead about the guy who did work on the IDL and found some stuff. Has there been any cooperation from what you heard to what we found here tonight, what we discovered here tonight?
I'm sorry, did you state?
Oh, sorry, the overseer, yeah.
Right, sorry.
No, I've had no cooperation in that, no.
We have a question from the audience about the Sexton site. Again, you said the dimensions of it were 30 by 25. How deep down is that trench?
It goes down for at least 3 or 4 feet. It's kind of hard to tell for sure because I have bad signal strength down that deep. I know it does continue a little bit further, but it's kind of fuzzy. I can't really tell.
So the trench itself would be 3 to 4 feet?
At the minimum.
And how far under the surface are we talking about?
So this is about 3 feet right here, and you can tell it extends down in a couple of cases a little
Sorry,
bit deeper than that.
We can't see the thing.
Because of the lighting, the laser pointer.
This is 3 feet.
That's 3 feet.
Yeah, and you can tell it continues a little bit further down, but it gets kind of fuzzy down here because of the nature of the soils at Oaklawn. So I know it goes down at least that far. I'd say it goes down at least 5, possibly 6, but it's a little
Does it start? Oh, wow, okay.
It starts pretty much just below the ground surface.
Just below the surface,
Yeah.
okay.
When, according to the sites that have already been surveyed and found promising, not counting the question I had about the ledge pipes at New Block, when will what we know is credible, when will that be excavated?
Anybody?
So the intention is to actually complete the feasibility study that will actually be addressing some of those logistical considerations of how to actually implement that plan moving forward. So that's kind of a difficult question to answer right now, but I think.
Well, when will the feasibility study be finished, or who will all be involved in that?
So we're looking at trying to complete that as a team over the coming weeks.
Team of who?
Those on this committee.
Okay.
And to present to the Public Oversight Committee. We're anticipating trying to get that completed by January so that we can put that before you for your consideration.
First, January, middle, end? Okay.
Probably towards the end, just given some of the kind of information that we have to compile and pull together and the holidays in between. So.
But to Reverend Turner's question, the goal is for you to present that at our February 3rd Oversight Committee meeting.
I think it would actually be good if we could try and provide that to you all in advance of that next meeting, so that you have the ability to consider that and then can hopefully then provide your input at that next meeting in an informed fashion.
Because one of the plans for the feasibility study, or one of the points of it, was to give the Public Oversight Committee the option of deciding which sites we prioritize. And so that was part of why we need to provide strategies for how we, what are the priorities and what are the cost benefits of pursuing a particular site, and then you, the committee, would decide. What I'm hearing tonight is that, we have 2 sites, but there's strong public interest in having the Booker T. Washington site also examined and, vetted for bids where we can excavate there. While that's a legal hurdle that is interesting, that it is part of how will the Public Oversight Committee decide where are we going next?
And one other question from the audience. The question is, I'm just going to quote it. It's becoming increasingly clear that the city of Tulsa played an undeniable role in helping perpetrate the massacre to the mayor. How will the city atone for this? Will you commit to reparations for what was taken and destroyed? And we talked about this at a few of our previous meetings. The focus for my administration and our team is to follow this where the truth leads us every step of the way. And we will take that one step at a time. What this investigation yields in the end, I can't jump ahead and say. But I think that folks need to know that the goal of this is to clarify the truth of what happened as best we can, and if that leads to further action that needs to be taken on the city's part, then we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But for now, we're just, and I want to add some historical context. one of the issues that they ran into when they did this state commission before is that members, I think people started talking about reparations early on, and that spooked a lot of politicians who then killed the process. We're not going to get into that. What we're going to focus on is every step of the way following this. That leads me to some other comments and questions that have come up tonight about the city's role in this over the last 100 years, the city's role in it over the last 45 years. I want you to know, I mean, there's a commitment from me and our team that I'm not here to defend anything wrong that the city has ever done on this, and we will just follow the truth where that takes us. I've also had a number of questions submitted from folks asking me about a letter that Representative Goodwin handed to me like 90 seconds before the meeting started. I gather from the questions it's about the police chief search. I haven't had a chance to read the letter, but I will get back to her, and I think there are a couple other people that signed it as well, and we'll follow up on that as well.
Where the truth leads us, Booker T. Washington Cemetery, I'm gonna circle back to that again, because it seems like it costs us a little difficult to get to because of the legal whatever. That has to be a site that we look at.
And I completely agree with you. And if there's been any indication or miscommunication on my part or on my team's part tonight, I want everyone here to know that we will pursue every avenue to scam. And I think it is disgraceful that we're having to work this hard to get the owner of that facility to cooperate. They should be bending over backwards in gratitude that we're trying to do this, not throwing up roadblocks. But they have. And so based on everything we've been able to look at from a legal standpoint, we can move more quickly if we can get them to agree to it. And so far, it's been an issue of just finding a way to make sure that if there is property damage, and to your point, I think it was your question, I don't foresee a lot of property damage from pushing around the little lawnmower thing. And so I don't believe that that's going to be a huge hurdle to cover. But we do need to give them some reassurance of that. And if they aren't, that they will not work on us, then we will pursue the legal option. But I want you to know, I don't want you to think that, and the reason we're pursuing the working with them options because that's a shorter time frame than the legal going through the courts. But we will pursue every avenue at our disposal to look at these sites. I don't want you to think that we're just saying, well, it was hard and we're not going to do it. We will do everything that we can to pursue it.
Is there a time frame on?
Well, I mean, we've been in communication with them today. Their attorneys. Their attorneys have been talking with our attorneys today about getting that resolved.
You commemorate those conversations in letters and that's part of it?
Yeah, it's all documented. I know we've been collecting a lot of questions. Does anybody else have a comment card or anything they need to submit before we, okay, we have a few other cards you can get from folks. Great. While we're collecting those, I know I received one comment from Mr. Miller, who says whether there's one found or 300, this investigation must continue. Completely agree. And a number of comments about the importance of following through on this, and I think everyone on our committee would completely agree with that as well. What we're looking ahead to for the February 3rd committee meeting, as was talked about, is I think a couple of things at least that I've taken note of tonight. One would be to have a public discussion of that feasibility study so we can talk about what phase 2 looks like at those different sites. 2 would be to have an update from our historical context committee about the stories that they have collected, because I know that they've had a good response on that. And then there have been a number of questions tonight just around the legal history at Booker T. Washington Cemetery, and we want to get clarity for the committee members on those questions as well.